Hello, I'm Lynn Veltri, and welcome to a special edition of Northwest Profiles. Coming up, in conjunction with the series American Experience, which in April will present an engaging and intelligent look at one of the nation's largest public works projects, the Grand Coulee Dam, we here at KSBS decided to dig into our Northwest Profile archives in search of stories we've produced over the years related to this iconic structure. Sure enough, we found two classics, both of which have been dusted off and polished up for your enjoyment. Our first story, titled History Underwater, focuses on the enormous impact the dam's construction had not only on the entire Northwest, but in particular on a small town located on the Columbia River named Marcus. Produced in 1997, it's a poignant story told through the eyes of two brothers who, along with growing up in Marcus, were proud to call it their hometown.
Magnificent, imposing, inspiring. These are just a few of the words that often come to mind when gazing upon the Grand Coulee Dam for the very first time. Built between 1933 and 1941, this massive structure, made of nearly 11 million cubic feet of concrete, is the largest dam of its kind and greatest single source of hydroelectric power in the nation. Measuring close to a mile wide and 46 stories high, the Grand Coulee Dam, by comparison, is 3 times the size of the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And that is why this grand dam, like the Great Pyramid, is viewed by many to be a modern-day wonder. A noble symbol of modern man's engineering skills and ingenuity, both used in this case to harness one of our greatest natural resources, the mighty Columbia River.
For years, back in the early 1900s, various people would come up with different schemes to dam the Columbia River and provide irrigation water for the Columbia Basin, turn it into an agricultural area. And what you see behind us here is a result of all of that thought process and planning and political process.
While irrigation was one of the primary purposes of the dam, it was by no means the only one. It was also designed and built for the generation of cheap hydroelectric power as well as for flood control along the Columbia. For more than a half-century since its completion in 1941, the Grand Coulee Dam, by most accounts, has far exceeded expectations, and in so doing has had and continues to have a profound impact on the entire Pacific Northwest region.
Of course, the impacts are both positive and negative. We've just talked about some of the positive impacts, the flood control, the irrigation development, the hydropower production, but we've also got the damming of a free-flowing river and the impacts on the communities that were there before the dam was built. There were both negative and positive impacts on that. The Spokane area probably had a positive impact because it drew business into the area, and Spokane, being the business center of eastern Washington, benefited from that. But then we have other smaller communities that were in what is now the reservoir were probably negatively impacted because those towns had to be moved, the buildings had to be torn down.
One of those communities that stood in the way of progress back in 1933 was the oldest town in Stevens County, the pioneer railroad town of Marcus. With a population of 600, Marcus was not only the oldest, but the largest and most prosperous of the 10 communities in all that would eventually be engulfed by the backwaters of the Grand Coulee Dam.
Well, it's quite an old town. The origins date back to in the 1840s when the Hudson Bay Company built a factory, as they called it. Fort Caldwell was properly named about 2.5 miles downriver from the town of Marcus. And a little bit later than that, about 1859, as I recall it, the border dispute between the United States and Canada was being resolved, and they sent out surveying parties, and the English party wintered at the old town site of Marcus and put up a few log cabins. And about that time, there was a gold discovery made along the riverbanks, and that, of course, presented a market. And there was a German and Jewish peddler came through. His name was Marcus Oppenheimer. And he utilized these buildings that the Border Commission people had abandoned several years earlier as his residence and as a store.
From those rather humble beginnings in 1862, Marcus Oppenheimer, for whom the town was later named, would, together with Joseph Monahan, officially establish the town in 1890. By 1901, the Great Northern Railroad, spurred on by the tremendous growth of the mining industry throughout the region, had built a bridge over the Columbia River at Marcus, and in turn made Marcus a very important railroad junction.
The railroad really changed the town. We had three branches coming, one from Spokane, one from Republic, and one from Nelson. And a roundhouse was built then, which is a repair shop for the old steam locomotives. And we also had superintendent's offices there. Fact is that during its heyday, there were, I think, around 3,000 people living in Marcus. And it had the fame of being a pretty wild town. One of the older residents there, a fellow by the name of Antoine Pellissier, who grew up in Marcus, and he told me one time that it was quite a place. He said, as I recall it, there were 15 saloons and 12 brothels in town. So it incurred quite a bit of notoriety.
While Marcus had its wild side, it was for the most part your typical Western pioneer town. A town built on hard work, self-reliance, and, when needed, a good dose of old-fashioned values. To those who lived there, like Bill and Harry Seidemann, who grew up on a farm just outside of town, Marcus was simply home.
Well, it was a very interesting life, very pleasant life, actually. We lived about a mile out of town on what was called at the time the Dobson Ferry Road, because between Marcus and the Columbia River, there were three roads out of town, one to Spokane, which was not impeded by the Columbia River, but if you wanted to go north up into Canada, you had to cross the river, and there was a ferry right at Marcus. But there was, if you wanted to go downriver to the south, they crossed at just below our home about a half a mile. There was a man by the name of Dobson operated a ferry across the river. And those years, the ferries were not motor powered. They were powered by the river itself. Well, anyway, that was where we lived, and there was a lot of traffic there, plus the fact that we also had the advantage of living near the only decent swimming hole in the community.
For people like Bill Seidemann, who have moved away from their hometown to live and work elsewhere, their fondest memories of home tend to fade over time. Yet, thankfully, most can easily rekindle those childhood memories just by going home again. Unfortunately, that's hard to do for those who grew up and moved on from the old town of Marcus, because usually there is hardly a trace to show that this one-time bustling railroad town ever existed. However, on occasion, due to larger-than-average snowpacks, the operator of the Grand Coulee Dam, the Bureau of Reclamation, is forced to reduce the water of Lake Roosevelt for flood control purposes. In 3 months, this mammoth reservoir is drawn down to reform the Columbia River as it once was. And in the process, the old town of Marcus reemerges.
You know, a lot of people think that there's still towns under there, but when the lake level drops, you won't see a town emerging. What you'll see is the old foundations, possibly the sidewalks, the streets that are still intact.
Beyond that, what the receding water reveals are bits and pieces of what life used to be like over a half-century ago. And while what's left isn't much, it's just enough to revive within Bill and Harry some of those fond memories of home.
The foundations are all so obliterated now by the rise and fall of the water every year that it's harder to tell whose house is on what bunch of broken up cement anymore. But some of them we know, like the old D.C. Corbin apartments. Man had the railroads built up here and built the biggest building in Marcus.
What do you make of this, Harry? This is, again, a puzzle to me.
We probably should know, but who knows everything what they ought to know?
No, this must be getting here to the old Corbin apartment building.
Yeah, this would have been the center of the building. You see, this was almost a block It was at least a half a block square, this building here.
It was a big building.
I believe 3 stories high, and it had a big balcony out over these sidewalks here. Remember that?
Yeah, it was a fancy place.
It was a fancy
very
building
ornate
in town.
Like any vibrant community, the old town of Marcus had a central business district. It was located close to the river, along what was called Main Street, a busy thoroughfare, once lined by spacious sidewalks and beautiful shade trees.
I think it was 1935 when they blacktopped Main Street.
Yeah, that's about when they did.
In old Marcus, you know, Bill, we had the hospital, we had the bank, we had the theater, we had 3 or 4 grocery stores, 2 butcher shops, and each one of the butchers had his own slaughterhouse in the woods outside of town, and feedlot. They bought their own cattle, fed them, kept them, slaughtered them, made their own sausage.
One of the more prominent features of the old town of Marcus was the Great Northern Railroad Bridge that stretched from the center of town northward across the Columbia. What made this landmark so interesting was the fact that between 1901 and 1941, there were 3 different bridges, all built in the same location.
They started the second bridge in 1928 or 29, and it was practically finished in the spring of 30, when we were in school, and they were doing some finish-up work there with a torch, and the sparks fell down, the timbers and everything there in that bridge were creosoted, and they caught fire. And the first bridge caught fire, and the other one was only 30 yards,
like
20 or 30 yards away, and it was blazing mightily, and the old bridge, which was a covered type bridge, caught fire too. And we just came in school. I was in the 1st grade, and here were these mighty big timber wooden bridges burning away.
Yeah, I remember the smoke was so heavy that it even almost darkened the sun for a time.
Well, after the 2 bridges had burned, they started the 3rd bridge and finished it in 1931.
The last area of town that Bill and Harry were eager to explore was where the railroad facilities once stood. This busy section of Marcus was of particular interest to the Seidemann brothers because it was here where their father worked in the roundhouse, and they spent a good deal of their time while growing up.
Okay, Harry, this is about to be where the depot stood. There isn't much left to see here, is there?
Well, this was the waiting room area here about.
Right, remember that there were 2 waiting rooms, Harry. One for the ladies and children, and one for the men.
True, that was the good old days.
Yeah.
And
remember, one of the dirty jobs was to clean the spittoons in the men's waiting rooms. Those old brass spittoons.
Yeah.
That was a job that
I always enjoyed listening to the clatter of the telegraph operator. He was about right here. Remember the old restaurant, which we called the Beanery then. Everybody called the Beanery then.
Well, it's where you got a plate of beans and a cup of coffee and a piece of pie.
Well,
in the early days, although Mrs.
Mullen had a good reputation as
she was
a
an
good
excellent cook. There isn't much to see here anymore.
Well, they used the cinders to keep the mud and dust down, I guess.
Hey, Harry, look at there.
Hey, that's a spoon out of the old restaurant.
Right.
Soup spoon. Hey, I'd like to remember her clam chowder. Oh, that was so good.
Yeah.
Man, look at that, Bill.
Yeah, genuine silver, German silver.
That'd be historical if we could remember who was eating with that.
The discovery of this small treasure marked the end of Bill and Harry's tour of their old hometown. Now, with their memories refreshed and plenty of stories to tell, it was time, as it was in 1941, to move on and wonder if they ever will be back again. That, of course, according to the Seidemann brothers, all depends on Mother Nature and time, which Bill and Harry both admit they're running short on. Yet, despite all the uncertainty, one thing remains a constant. The waters of Lake Roosevelt, now gone, will soon be back once again to reclaim the old town of Marcus.
As I mentioned, our profile on Marcus premiered on KSPS 15 years ago in November of 1997. Now, if you're wondering what happened to the Seidemann brothers who were featured in our profile, I'm sad to say that Harry passed away in 1998, just a year after our story first aired. As for Bill, who was a Spokane resident when we first met him in '97, he and his wife are now living in Idaho, just outside the small town of Cul-de-sac. And according to his family, he's doing quite well considering he just celebrated his 91st birthday earlier this month. For our next story, titled The Power of Light, we again turn the calendar back to the mid-1990s. In fact, it was the summer of '96 when we traveled to Grand Coulee Dam to witness some entertainment on a grand scale. Projected across the entire span of the dam, Grand Coulee's Laser Light Show was developed as an educational tool for the Department of Reclamation. And to this day, it continues to provide entertainment for all ages.
On a spring afternoon in the desert, nature makes few sounds. A bird, the wind. For real noise, leave it to man. And yet one of man's most powerful inventions makes little noise. Here in Washington's Columbia Basin, Grand Coulee Dam stands huge and silent until nature spills over. Even 12 million cubic yards of concrete can't hold back the Columbia. Visitors come to see the dam, but the water steals the show until nightfall.
Well, we've done a light show here at Grand Coulee since sometime in the 1950s.
Each night during the summer months, the spillway of Grand Coulee Dam becomes a giant movie screen. But only a high-tech production will do for this engineering marvel, a 36-minute laser show. Craig Sprankle works at the dam for the Bureau of Reclamation.
Actually, we were at the point where we had to replace that light system. And we started talking to people around the community and had some public workshops, and that's where the idea for the lasers came out, and we just sort of followed it through from there.
Tourists gather at the Visitors Center just after dusk, as they have since 1989.
In all, inexpensive hydroelectricity in the Pacific Northwest attracted wartime industries representing over $1 billion. A region that had no aluminum production at all soon produced 40% of all U.S. aluminum. With just a small fraction of my potential energy being harnessed, enough energy was now being produced to meet this demand, making the Columbia Basin Project a significant help not only to the Pacific Northwest economy, but to the United States and the end of World War II.
Okay, this is our control panel. What you're seeing here is
inside the Visitors Center is a little room that's off limits to visitors. It's the home of 4 huge lasers. Mark Edwards is a technician for the Bureau.
The kryptons produce the red wavelength, the red beams, and the 2 argons produce the blue and green light that we see out on the show. We can walk around
Gases
here
inside each laser determine the range of colors. The beams are projected through filters which change their colors. They bounce along a series of mirrors which regulate the light flow and intensity.
Come out here, and over there, and go onto all these optics, and it goes through an optical path, and then out onto these scanners, and the scanners have little tiny mirrors that are about the size of your little fingernail, and they're on a galvo that moves, and that's what traces the image out on the dam. There's 2 scanners in each scanner.
Once the laser beams are produced and regulated, the scanners do all the work. Through tiny, quick vibrations, they reflect the beam's tracing patterns onto the dam.
What it is, it's a point source. The laser is a point source, and it moves so fast because of persistence of vision, a person's persistence of vision. It looks like it's drawing a solid image, and that's done through these cards that control the position and the rate of scan out on the dam.
This bank of computers runs the show. With music, sound effects, a narrator, and hundreds of fanciful and realistic laser images, it's a complicated production that goes off flawlessly each night.
Where before, uncontrollable forces of nature could lead to a devastating flood, now the Grand Coulee Dam, with the enormous capacity of Lake Roosevelt, has sufficient space to help control these wild flows.
As you can see on the beam when it's out there, you can see all sorts of little sparkles close in where it leaves the beam block, just where it leaves the building. The little sparkles are dust particles in the air, and if you happen to see a real bright one, that's a bug flying through and getting zapped. It's like a giant bug zapper also.
With lasers, safety is crucial. These are low-intensity units, unlike those used for surgery or to cut steel. That's why they don't damage the surface of the dam. Even so, if you look directly at one for any length of time, you could go blind. Even a reflection off a Mylar balloon could be dangerous. A mask is attached where the beam leaves the projector. It allows the beam to travel only onto the surface of the dam, so that if something went wrong and a beam went wild, the mask would prevent it from harming anyone. And there are 2 kill switches installed at the visitor center.
And either one of those will stop the laser or power the lasers down if one of the people manning those buttons sees something that could be a danger to the public.
Glenn Stoffer is another Bureau technician. Both he and Edwards respect the dangers that go with working with lasers.
We were required to take examinations of our eyes before we started in '89. They checked to see that there were no laser burns.
Both engineers say they've been careful and never had a safety problem.
At Grand Coulee Dam alone, my waters can generate a staggering 6.5 million kilowatts, the equivalent energy of over 8.7 million horsepower. This electricity not only provides a large share of the power needs for the entire Pacific Northwest, it generates revenue to pay for the dam and help to fund the irrigation development in the region.
There is no shortage of power at Grand Coulee. That's important when it comes to lasers. Each of these units has its own DC power supply. They generate so much heat, they must be water-cooled. All this machinery cost plenty in 1989, and there have been updates since. But Bureau of Reclamation officials feel the expense has paid off over the years.
The purpose in doing the show was to educate people on Grand Coulee, Bureau of Reclamation, and what we do. But to do it in such a way that it was entertaining, that people went away thinking they'd been entertained, but they'd actually been educated. And I think it fills the bill there.
The story, the lights, telling the story, I thought that was really nice.
Really good. I want to come back and see it again sometime.
I thought it was fantastic. I'm going to encourage everybody I know to come up and see it.
As you might imagine, with the march of technology, the Grand Coulee Dam Laser Light Show is now bigger and more spectacular than ever before. So check it out. The show is free and runs nightly from late May through the end of September. And with that, it's time to turn out the lights on this special edition of Northwest Profiles. Don't forget, on the way in April, public television, through one of its most revered series, American Experience, will take a closer look at the building of Grand Coulee Dam, its impact and legacy going forward. Here's a small preview of what you'll see.
Grand Coulee is going to be the biggest thing on Earth. It's going to create farms, electricity, jobs.
It blocked the West's wildest river and changed the course of history.
Harry Truman said that without Grand Coulee, it would have been almost impossible to win the war.
But the mammoth project that benefited millions wasn't built for free.
When you block a river, there's no going back.
Grand Coulee Dam on American Experience.
Again, that's Grand Coulee Dam on American Experience, coming to both KSBS HD and KSBS World in April. Check your local listings or go online to ksbs.org for specific dates and times. Until next time, this is Lynn Veltri saying so long, and remember, living in the beautiful Northwest provides us with plenty to see and explore, like the Grand Coulee Dam. Just remember, when you do, you take time to enjoy the view.